Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to take a look at smaller states resisting and responding to imperialism, or as I like to call it, Thailand, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Japan walk into a bar. That's a setup for an old joke you might be a little too young for, but that's okay. Essentially, we're going to take a look at the equivalent of Chapter 31, Part 2, and this covers Japan and a couple of other states that aren't actually covered in Chapter 31, but they have some interesting similarities to Japan that I think we can learn a lot from. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following questions. How did the smaller states of Afro-Eurasia utilize economic and political context to maintain their independence from European powers? And how did changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution present political and economic challenges to the smaller states of Afro-Eurasia? In essence, we're going to be looking at a lot of the same challenges that were faced by the larger landed empires that we talked about last time, except this time we're going to look at it through the lens of some smaller states. And these smaller states, they all faced a number of challenges. These states were either newly established, like Egypt, they were semi-feudal, like Thailand or Ethiopia, or they were previously isolated. I say isolated in air quotes because Japan was not actually isolated. And their responses to the increasing pressure of Europeans and Americans. And they had to deal with a number of challenging issues, such as how do you avoid the fate of the larger empires like the Ottoman Empire or the Qing dynasty? How do you participate in the world system of trade without becoming a dependent colony? How do you balance your traditional government style and your traditional culture with European styles of government and adapting to European culture? How best to reorganize your state without antagonizing your landed elites? And how best to unite your people around a new system of government? These were seriously challenging questions, and these were no less difficult to deal with in the large empires. We're going to see how some of the smaller states managed to deal with those big questions. So let's begin in East Africa, on the Horn of Africa. Let's talk about Ethiopia. Now, you might remember Ethiopia from way back in Unit 1, where it was an illustrated example, but then we haven't really talked about Ethiopia since then. So it's worth remembering Ethiopia has actually played a really big role in world history. One of the motivations for venturing out into the age of exploration was the search for the legendary Ethiopian king, Prester John. And while they never found Prester John, eventually the Portuguese made contact with the Ethiopian kingdom and even assisted them and managed to prevent Ethiopia from being annexed into the Islamic world. However, these wars that were fought between the Somali sultans and the Ethiopian kings, they devastated the kingdom. So we're talking almost 200 years of constant warfare, and large sections of Ethiopia were depopulated and were opened up to migrations by other nomadic peoples from other parts of Africa into Ethiopia. And this sort of begins a period known as the Zemene Mesafint, also known as the Age of Princes. And you can think about it kind of like a warring states period, where there is a king. There's officially an emperor or king of Ethiopia, usually the head of the Solomonic dynasty. And essentially, nobody was really in charge. All these princes only managed to have control over their own royal camps and maybe the ancient capital, but nobody was really in charge of Ethiopia. And this sort of came to a head when the leader of Ethiopia, Tewodros II, irritated the British by kidnapping a number of missionaries who had come to Ethiopia, which led to the British expedition, what's known as the British expedition to Abyssinia or Ethiopia, which unfortunately resulted in the destruction of his palace and him actually committing suicide, the leader of Ethiopia committing suicide to avoid being captured by the British. And although this was a devastating blow to Ethiopia, the future kings began to realize it was going to be necessary to centralize their authority if they were going to be able to resist any other British expedition or any other European power. It's also worth noting the kidnapping of the missionaries was actually just trying to get the attention of the British. Tewodros had actually been fighting a number of wars against the local Muslim sultanates, and he wanted, again, European assistance, who he sent a number of letters out, but none of them were responded to. And so he decided maybe kidnapping some missionaries would get the attention of the Europeans. So Tewodros was succeeded eventually by Johannes IV, who reigned until 1889. And what's critical about Johannes IV's reign is that Ethiopia was dealing with a number of foreign invasions, from the newly established state of Egypt to the modest state in Sudan. And while he managed to beat off both of these invasions, he himself was actually killed fighting the Mahdists in 1889. He used these attempted invasions to further solidify his own power. For example, he used the peace treaty with Egypt to gain access to modern weapons. He also tried to forcefully unify the religion of his country. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been the religion of the royal house and a number of the ethnic groups across the kingdom, and he tried to forcefully convert anybody who wasn't in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to the church. The Muslims of Ethiopia rejected this and promptly protested by going on a tax revolt for a little bit until Johannes eventually sort of calmed down and let the whole thing go. But he did bring together the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had been broken up into several different schisms at the time. Johannes IV was succeeded by Menelik II, who you might know as the famous one who's going to win the Battle of Adwa. And the thing is, Menelik II was actually not part of the Solomonic dynasty. He was part of a small regional kingdom called the Shiwa Kingdom, and he was married Johannes' sister. This was part of Johannes' efforts to internally solidify his hold over Ethiopia, which was to marry into the powerful kingdoms around the Ethiopian heartland, right? And this also included conquering the nomadic Oromo people who had moved into Ethiopia during those 200 years of warfare with the Somali sultans. Now, the Oromo were nomadic, and the much larger settled Ethiopian population by 1800 moved into the territory of the Oromo, which is the modern highlands of Ethiopia, close to the border with South Sudan. And what they did was they appropriated the land. They increased their farming output by taking land from the nomads. They also implemented a regular tax system and a land distribution system, which Johannes IV and Menelik II himself would use to settle Ethiopians in this region, as well as increase their own authority by giving land to loyal subjects. So we see a little bit of internal expansion, and we're going to see a map on the next slide that's going to discuss this. So if you look at this map up here in the right-hand corner, the purple indicates the heartland of the empire at the time Menelik took the throne, and then his outward expansion to the contemporary borders of Ethiopia. So Menelik II is known as the king who defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, but he did a lot of other really cool things too. He founded the city of Addis Ababa, which is the current capital of Ethiopia, in 1886. Previously, the kings of Ethiopia had had one of two types of capitals. They had been mobile capitals, that is, they moved with the king. The capital was wherever the king happened to be, or it might have been the sacred city of Gondar, which was a holy site. He also sponsored the creation of a railway known as the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, and so he allowed the French to build a railway from their port on the coast, which is now Djibouti, to the interior of Ethiopia. And this allowed for Ethiopia to participate in international trade, in particular to purchase weapons from European arms dealers, most famously Nikolai Leontiev, who provided Menelik II with many of his weapons that he was going to use to defeat the Italians. This also allowed him to reach a wider audience. Menelik famously sent a letter to many Europeans, which he attempted to appeal to their common Christian identity in securing his independence, not being part of the ongoing scramble for Africa. And this is really interesting because at the time when the scramble for Africa begins, which we're going to talk about in our next lecture, that is the Europeans attempting to take territory from Africa, Ethiopia had the unusual benefit of not really being the primary interest of Europeans. The British were concerned with Egypt and South Africa. The French were concerned with West Africa. The Belgians were concerned with Central Africa. Nobody, until the Italians, was actually really that concerned with the Ethiopian highlands and the Horn of Africa. The British had their territory in Egypt and along the coast of what is now Yemen, and so they had their route to India secured. Menelik II also made an attempt to suppress the slave trade, although this had mixed results, and he was not able to fully extinguish the slave trade, even though he created several royal decrees declaring that slavery and enforced servitude would be outlawed. Many people simply ignored these and continued to hold slaves and continued the practice of enslaving, which is a reminder that sometimes even an all-powerful king is limited. Without a doubt, Menelik II's greatest achievement is probably his preservation of Ethiopian independence by defeating the Italians at the Battle of Adwa. Italy had established itself along the coast, what is now Somalia, Eritrea, and Somaliland, and they had their eyes on annexing or turning Ethiopia into a puppet state or annexing it outright. And so they signed a treaty with Ethiopia, known as the Treaty of Wuchale, in which they had attempted to assert their rights over Ethiopia's foreign policy. And there were two versions of the treaty, and the difference in the interpretation hinged on a couple of words in Italian versus Amharic, which is the language of Ethiopia. Specifically, the words themselves had different levels of intensity. And so when Menelik II discovered this difference of the treaty, he tore it up and refused to abide by it. And then the Italians promptly invaded, and they were defeated. Not only were they outnumbered by the Ethiopian military, they were also ill-equipped, because remember, Ethiopia had been able to buy modern weapons from the international market. And as can be seen in this famous painting that's in a church in Ethiopia, about the Battle of Adwa. They have as many guns, if not more guns, than the Italians do, and there's more of them. It really was maybe not as grand a victory as we like to sometimes imagine it, but nonetheless, Adwa and Ethiopia would become a symbol of African resistance and a symbol of the Pan-African movement worldwide. You might have heard of the Rastafarian movement. That is in part inspired by the influence that Ethiopia had globally at the turn of the 20th century because it was able to maintain its independence. But we'll talk more about that when we get there. This battle also solidified Ethiopia's borders in their current form. Through Johannes IV and Menelik II, Ethiopia reached its current form and maintained its independence through a combination of international trade and internal expansion. Let's talk a little bit about another African power, which would be Egypt. Now, Egypt had almost always been ruled by a foreign power since ancient times. The last independent Egyptian dynasty predated the Persians. After that, it's simply a succession of foreigners either ruling over Egypt or being ruled as part of an empire. But with the rise of a governor named Muhammad Ali Pasha, who worked for the Ottoman Empire in Egypt, but he himself was born in what is now Albania. He takes advantage of the situation in Egypt after Napoleon's attempted invasion to seize control and drive out the Ottomans and assert himself as the ruler of Egypt. Although technically, he was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Nonetheless, he asserted himself as ruler of Egypt. And he took the title, which I hope I'm pronouncing this right, of Khedive, which was something akin to viceroy. It was a stronger title than governor, which he had previously had. Now, Ali Pasha attempted to centralize his authority, and he did this in part by massacring the Mamluk elite, Cairo, in 1811. You might remember, again, way back in Unit 1, the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled over Egypt. They had been annexed by the Ottomans during the 1500s, but they were still allowed to own the land and rule on behalf of the Turks. However, Ali Pasha decided, no, we're not going to have any of that, and promptly had them destroyed as a political force. He then took all the land in Egypt for himself, and then would use that to sort of distribute to those who would pursue his interests and help him achieve his goals. He sought to promote a sort of Egyptian nationality, if you will. He established a European style of bureaucracy. He also established the first, what historians call the first Egyptian army. That is an army of Egyptian peasants using modern weapons, a conscripted army. And he would go on to use this army very extensively. He would wage wars in the Mediterranean. He would help the Ottoman Empire suppress revolts in Greece and Crete, although his army was forced to withdraw from Greece. He would also use his army to defeat the first Saudi state. As you can see in this map here in the right-hand corner, his army campaigned very far and very wide. And some scholars speculate that he was actually intending to replace the Ottoman Empire. He did launch an invasion up the Levant into what is now modern Turkey, and he defeated the Ottomans several times. However, the European powers intervened to stop him as they were worried about a new rising power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so he was forced to consolidate his power around the heartland of Egypt and Sudan. And he proceeded to import modern weapons and build naval shipyards. This is a painting of Muhammad Ali Pasha and of the modern ships he had commissioned to be constructed in Egypt. Ali Pasha really took this European modernization story to heart, so much so that he began to establish textile factories on the Nile River, and he encouraged the growth of cotton. The Nile River being a very fertile region, well watered, it was perfect for growing cotton. And Muhammad Ali Pasha essentially wanted to have an industrial revolution on the scale of Great Britain, and that wasn't actually unheard of. Egypt had a long history of producing textiles. You might have heard of something called Egyptian thread count. Your bed might be Egyptian thread count. It was not inconceivable that Egypt might have a textile-based industrial revolution. That's how all the other industrial revolutions had happened. With the colonies that Ali Pasha had established in Sudan and parts of Arabia to fund this attempted industrialization, he began to encourage cotton production as well as textile production. However, over time, Ali Pasha and his successors began to shift away from the textile production. It became apparent that the British textile industry, which was already fully matured, would always be able to outcompete the Egyptian textile industry under the auspices of free trade. And so gradually, beginning in the 1830s onward, the rulers of Egypt focused more and more on the growth of cotton and the export of cotton, which really peaked during the US Civil War, when there was no cotton coming from the United States, and Egypt was one of the world's largest cotton suppliers. And so the successors of Ali Pasha went a little crazy, borrowing tons of money to sponsor more cotton production. But the problem was, Egypt is, compared to the United States, a very small country, and the peak Egyptian cotton production was only 12 to 15% of US annual production in a given year. From the 1860s onward, with the crash of the cotton prices and the massive debt that was being accumulated by the rulers of Egypt, Europeans began to gradually assert more and more control over the Egyptian economy, somewhat similar to the Ottoman Empire and the capitulations. Now, that's not to say that Ali Pasha's successors did not make an attempt to modernize Egypt technologically. They built railroads, they built telegraph lines, they built a modern theater in Cairo, which was a really big festive event when it opened, and they made a deal with British and French companies to construct a canal that would connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This is called the Suez Canal. The idea was that perhaps Egypt could use the money, which they would get a lot of from the tolls in this canal, because they owned about half of it. They could use the money to further their modernization projects and maybe not have to take out so many loans from the Europeans, and maybe even help make Egypt a major naval power. The problem with debt, though, is the more you accumulate, the higher the interest is. Eventually, the leaders of Egypt, I believe the fourth descendant of Ali Pasha, was unable to service the debt and was forced to sell off Egypt's share of the Suez Canal to the British. And then when they were unable to pay off their debt at all, the British effectively took control of the Egyptian economy and sort of transformed Egypt into a cotton-producing region of the British Empire. Now, peasants who had been forced to do, among other things, serve in the army, work in the cotton fields, and dig the Suez Canal were not very happy. And the military was not very happy at being sidelined by the British. There were a number of small revolts against Ali Pasha's successors. And eventually, in one riot, which killed a number of British citizens, the British bombarded Alexandria in 1882, effectively destroying the city. They then took over Egypt and put the descendant of Ali Pasha back on the throne. And from 1882 until the 1920s, Egypt was effectively a British colony. Egypt is a very interesting story for a number of reasons. It is a bold attempt to industrialize by arguably one of the smallest powers to attempt industrialization. And had they succeeded, they would have been the third country outside of Europe before World War II who managed to successfully industrialize, the other two being Japan and the United States. But a combination of excessive borrowing and perhaps geographic proximity to Europe and being on a strategically significant transit route put Egypt in a very bad position, along with perhaps the dreams of Ali Pasha, which led him and his descendants to borrow lots of money in an attempt to transform Egypt into another European-style society. Egypt presents a particularly fascinating story of government support for industrialization, military expansion, and the long arm of imperialism. Let's shift our attention over to Southeast Asia and talk about a place called Thailand. Now, in your textbooks, you might see this referred to as Siam. So Siam is an older name for the country. The name Thailand was not actually used until the 1930s. Same thing like Iran and Persia. For the sake of this presentation, we're just going to say Thailand. We're going to keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Beginning in the 1800s, Thailand was actually not in a bad position. It had just been unified under a new dynasty. They had a new capital, this place called Bangkok that was on a major river that led out to the ocean. This new government had reformed the Buddhist monkhood. This is a really big part of society in Thailand even today. Everybody does at least some time as a Buddhist monk. So reforming the monkhood was a really big deal. Ensuring the loyalty of the monkhood to the government was a really big deal. And through a number of small conflicts with neighbors, they managed to solidify their borders, specifically neighbors being Vietnam and Burma. And so we come to the story of King Rama IV, also known as Mongkut the Great, also known as the King from The King and I. But in addition to being apparently a great singer, because I saw the musical, he was also a great reformer. Now, Rama IV, he's really interesting. So he was a Buddhist monk before he became the king. He was a monk for, I believe, 20 years. And then after he was done being a monk and became the king, he got a Western-style education, I believe up to the equivalent of a university degree. So this guy was versed in many different traditions. It's quite amazing. What may be the most amazing was that in 1868, he sought to impress a number of dignitaries, foreign dignitaries who were visiting Thailand. And so he took them up to an observatory he himself had built, and he himself had calculated that there was going to be a solar eclipse using, interestingly enough, a combination of traditional Thai mathematics and Western mathematics, and so impressed all the dignitaries by knowing exactly at what time that the eclipse was going to occur. It's a very cool story. But more than just being able to predict eclipses, he was able to centralize the government by bringing in what we might call European-style geography. Prior to this, almost all the countries in Southeast Asia had been on something called a mandala system, which is kind of a way of saying there were a number of large centers, and these large centers were where political authority radiated out of. Rama IV simply said, we're going to undo that, and we're going to just simply establish the borders of our kingdom, and we're going to have our capital right here. He also took somewhat of a drastic step, and refused to send an emissary to the Qing dynasty. This region had long been within the tributary system. This was a big symbolic gesture, if nothing else. Perhaps one of the most decisive moments of his reign was something called the Bowring Treaty of 1854, which was an unequal treaty. You might remember the unequal treaties that were imposed upon China. This was an unequal treaty imposed upon Thailand by the British, which effectively abolished royal control of the trade. Now, you might remember, again, way back in Unit 1, that the states of Southeast Asia made most of their income off trade. And so the abolishment of the royal controls over trade, at least initially, had a damaging effect on the Thai government's source of income. And this, of course, is another example of the British insisting at the point of a gun that they be allowed to trade with your country or else. There were some ecological and economic consequences, which is that because now the country was open, the merchants could trade with the British at any level, at any time, at any place. Exporting rice to British colonies and to Britain itself became a really big business. The British would buy up a lot of rice from Thailand. And so a young, enterprising merchant class set out from the capital and from the major cities out into the sort of jungle lands of Thailand that hadn't been settled yet, and set up these massive rice plantations that were designed for export. And so rice export led to this creation of a new sort of middle class, if you will, of Thailand, these merchants, some of whom were very supportive of the monarchy, as well as ecological change in the form of deforestation, a shift to intense rice cultivation, which had not been the case previously. Previously, most people had practiced a form of subsistence rice agriculture, and they might have paid tribute in rice, but large rice plantations were not the norm prior to this treaty. So Rama IV was succeeded by Rama V, and one of the defining features of Rama V's reign was his short conflict with France. Now, the Thai military had been attempting to modernize, as most other young states were trying to do, and unfortunately, it was not modern enough to defeat the French. However, the French, being so far away from home, were not able to effectively defeat the Thai army so completely. And so, although Thailand was forced to give up the territory that composes of modern-day Laos, they were not totally occupied, and they did not become a colony or some sort of protectorate of France. It was after this defeat that Rama V decided to become the first monarch in Thai history to tour Europe and meet with the other monarchs of Europe, effort to gain recognition. And he also sent his sons, the royal princes, to be educated in Europe. I should mention, by the way, this is not the first time Thailand has had contact with Europe. There was actually a very famous emissary sent to the court of Louis XIV from Thailand, but it was the first time that a king had gone to Europe. Usually the story is told that Thailand managed to escape colonization by being a buffer state between British Burma and French Indochina. And that's true, but usually the narrative is Thailand is simply the passive object of negotiations. Nonetheless, the fact that the Thai monarchy made an effort to gain legitimacy in the eyes of other monarchs, as can be seen in this photo down here, where Rama V is meeting with Tsar Nicholas II, is a reminder that agency in history is something that we need to always consider. And at home, of course, Rama V continued many of the reforms of his father. So he continued to centralize the government, creating something called the Monthon system, which essentially turned the entire kingdom into administrative units that were hierarchically arranged. Sort of like you'd have in the United States, where you'd have a city, a county, a state, and then the federal government. You had a hierarchy like that. But what this effectively did was it ended the traditional system of feudal lords, some of whom had previously been independent kingdoms, simply being administered from the capital. This actually resulted in, I think, 3 different revolts of people who were unhappy with the change of the system. And this was followed up in 1907 by a survey of land, which was an attempt to scientifically map the entire country of Thailand and break it up into land parcels. Combine this with a modern army created via the Conscription Act in 1905 that was led by European trained officers and placed directly under the authority of the king. On the question of labor organization, the king did gradually abolish forced labor in all of its forms. Corvée, which is forced labor obligations, as well as slavery, by 1905. Historians believe that he did this for 2 reasons. One was to limit the power of the nobles by depriving them of their labor sources. And 2 is to create a new pool of conscripts for the army. If you suddenly don't have any labor obligations, you can come serve in the military to help make Thailand strong. So Thailand did manage to maintain its independence through a combination of internal reforms, centralization, a little bit of geographic luck, happening to be between 2 European colonies and playing one off the other via the tour of Europe. But it's also worth noting that Thailand, in some ways, was a little bit lucky, having gone through a dynastic transition right as the age of imperialism and industrialism was getting heated up. It allowed it some flexibility to reform that other nations didn't have. Let's end by talking about Japan, the legendary case of Japan, the shogun, to the Meiji Restoration. You might remember the shogunate established its control over Japan in 1600. And from 1600 until the 1860s, the shogun ruled Japan with a pretty solid iron fist. And things were relatively quiet. The only conflicts and wars that the Japanese dealt with at this time were clashes with the indigenous Ainu on the island of Hokkaido, occasional peasant revolts over taxation, as well as dealing with Russian pirates and fur traders in the north. But all of this internal quiet, the end of the warring states period, meant that there was an increase in the population. The internal trade in rice meant that there was a developed market economy within this isolated kingdom. And there was already a sense of nationalism brewing, right? Egypt and to a lesser extent, Ethiopia and Thailand all attempted to create national identities as part of their centralization process. But in Japan, that process was long underway before their encounter with the Europeans. I talked a little bit about native learning way back in chapter 26, but essentially it was an attempt to sort of unraveling, for example, Shintoism from Buddhism, which had essentially become inseparable by the 1600s. So, native learning, a form of nationalism. In some ways, Japan was really set for what was to come next. And that was that the US was going to show up at their doorstep, specifically Commodore Matthew Perry, and he's going to give them a letter essentially saying, hey, we'd like to trade with you. Please trade with us. And even though the shogun and many of the conservative daimyo didn't like this, the shogun was not militarily strong enough to resist the US, later the British and the French and the Russians. And so the shogun lost a lot of legitimacy among his more conservative daimyo who were afraid of the influence of the Westerners. And so as a result, these conservative daimyo, and remember this word conservative, they gathered around the young Emperor Meiji and they had him restored in 1866. They launched a coup, put the emperor back on the throne. Now, of course, this was resisted violently in some cases. The Boshin War may have been very short, but it was very deadly. This forced a number of daimyo to choose whether they were going to support the emperor or support the shogun. And in the end, despite having foreign support from France, the shogun was defeated, and the last shogun went into a quiet exile. And the restoration of the Emperor Meiji led to something known as the Charter Oath, which was a series of pledges, 5 specifically, but essentially promised a more representative government, although it wasn't specific about what exactly it meant by representatives. It promised something that sounded a little bit like life and liberty, as well as it promised to explore this new technological world that Japan had seemingly been missing for the last 200 years. So essentially, it promised to transform Japan into a modern society. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in our next lecture, but understand that from the outset, the Meiji Restoration was about modernizing Japan. And one of the first things they set about working on, although it took a long time, was the creation of a constitution and a national assembly, that is an elected body that passes laws in the name of the emperor. While the emperor still held all the power and the emperor still held political authority, the emperor didn't make laws. The assembly made laws in the name of the emperor. What's really interesting about the Constitution of Japan is that Japan sent scholars, very smart people, to all the major countries of the world and looked at their constitutions, the United States, Great Britain, Germany, France. And in the end, they settled on something that was mostly the German Constitution with a little bit of the British Constitution. But it's very rare in history, at least up to this point in history, just would copy verbatim a constitution or elements of a constitution. One of the big parts of this transition was the complete abolition of the feudal structure in 1871. And this meant that all the daimyo, starting with the daimyo who had resisted the Meiji Restoration, but later all other daimyo, were made governors of their domains. So their positions would no longer be inheritable. They were going to have to run in elections at some point. Daimyo were transformed from feudal lords into regional governors. And the samurai also saw a shift in their position. Although they lost their privileges that they had traditionally held, they were compensated in some cases by very high positions in the newly created Japanese military. That said, some of you might have heard of the famous Satsuma Rebellion, which was popularized in American imagination via Tom Cruise's movie, The Last Samurai. And this is a reminder, as we've seen in literally every other state so far, that centralization is often resisted either by the elites or sometimes by the peasants themselves, or sometimes both, because transforming a country can be a very difficult and painful thing. Ways of life changing can be a really big deal. But let's talk about Japan in the Meiji era, which lasted until 1912 when Emperor Meiji passed away. So the centralization of authority led to one of the more stable business environments that we've seen. Now, remember that Japan already had an internal market system. They already had mechanisms for buying and selling, and even local productions. So when Japan began to undertake industrialization, it followed a pattern that many other nations had followed, and that is it sought to mechanize its textile production, always textiles, except in this case, it wasn't cotton, it was silk. They sought to mechanize their silk production, which they did. And then what they did was they basically took over the American market for silk. Previously, China had dominated the American market for silk. But in the case of Japan, its ability to produce lots of silk, in part by incentivizing peasants to breed silkworms alongside their other crops, meant that Japanese silk was more competitive on the international market. This was followed up by an entire education system to educate future Japanese leaders and businessmen on the ways of the world. And this included sending out a mission called the Iwanakura Mission, which essentially involved a number of scholars going to the United States and Europe and literally just looking around and being like, hey, what can we learn from all of this? And what they brought back, they proceeded to put into place pretty quickly. Japan had railroads, and by 1900, they had 3,000 miles of railroad. That's quite a bit for only 25 years. They established a Bank of Japan, which helped finance a lot of these early industrial projects. You might remember that one of the prerequisites, one of the things that assisted British industrialization, was the establishment of a number of banks in Britain, like the Baring Brothers, to assist with industrialization via loans and financial assistance. So all of these things, the going out and exploring, the establishment of an education system, the establishment of a financial system, all of this led to a very, very rapid increase in Japanese industrial production. Started with the silk industry, it moved to the steel industry, as it did in Europe as well. And this led to the conglomeration of large companies. These large companies, which may not have been the most competitive with one another because they were so large, but nonetheless, they employed a lot of people and they were able to produce a lot of goods for the state, were known as zaibatsu. And the zaibatsu were officially supported by the government. The government did not attempt to break them up. The government did not attempt to interfere with their labor practices. What we see in Japan is a heightened support for industrialization that resulted in the concentration of industrial power in a number of very small companies, some of which you might know, like Mitsubishi, for example, was a zaibatsu. And somewhat emboldened by its new industrial might, Japan went on an expansion spree. And we'll talk more about this in chapter 32. But this involved annexing historically occupied territories like the Ryukyu Islands. It also involved going to war with China and defeating them pretty handedly, and then going to war with Russia and defeating them pretty handedly. And the defeat of China in particular convinced Europeans that they could no longer enforce the unequal treaties that they had enforced upon Japan. So of all the countries that had unequal treaties, such as Thailand, China, and Japan, only Japan was able to get rid of them through the use of military force. And that military force allowed Japan to create a colonial empire in Asia, specifically parts of the Pacific, Taiwan, and Korea. Served as a market for manufactured goods in Japan. They also served as a source of extra food, as well as sometimes coal and iron ore imports if they were needed. All of this sort of accumulated in a recognition of Japan's economic military growth. In 1902, when Great Britain, or the premier world naval power, broke its traditional policy of not making alliances with anybody, which it had had since the end of the age of Napoleon, and made a naval alliance with Japan in 1902. It was a very big step and a very big recognition that Japan had made it in the world, because now it was allied with the premier naval power of the world. Of course, there were limits to Japan's industrialization. It may have been able to produce modern weapons, but they still weren't producing modern battleships. It had a great big navy that it used to defeat the Russians, but most of those ships had actually been purchased from Great Britain, not produced in Japan itself. Japan would actually not start producing its own warships until the 1920s. Japan is a very interesting story because Japan managed to successfully industrialize, the only country outside of the European tradition, which would include Europe, Russia, and the United States, to undertake industrialization successfully. And there's just so many reasons for that. It's hard, it's impossible to boil it down to just one. You have the government support of industry, which is something the College Board wants you to know, but you also have some geographic luck, being so far away from the centers of power that might try to challenge industrialization. You had a previously unified state under the Tokugawa shogunate. You had government support in the form of being willing to put down any form of peasant uprising or tax protest. There's just so many possible reasons for the Industrial Revolution to take place in Japan where it did, that Japan's ability to rise above the chaos, industrialize, and build a colonial empire really does make it stand out in world history. So let's sort of wrap this up with talking about some common themes among these small states. So these small states all underwent political and cultural centralization in some respect. And this usually meant moving away from what we might call a feudal system or a semi-feudal system to something of a national system. So the creation of a national identity, whether that's around a particular figure or around a particular idea. Nationalism in the European sense could be seen in these nations, although I don't know if they would have called it that. It definitely has the traits. And there was also economic integration, but not dependence. Now, some of this was chalked up to geography. So Thailand was too far away, and Ethiopia was too far away to be effectively challenged by imperial powers who were busy doing other things, such as attacking China or attacking Egypt. But they were able to participate in the global economy without becoming colonies, except Egypt. And it was this participation in the global economy that allowed specifically Thailand and Ethiopia to centralize much faster than they might have been able to. And of course, there is the tepid use of Western technology, which could become a trap. Egypt shows that if you borrowed too much money and tried to industrialize too fast and maybe somewhat recklessly, you could end up just becoming a colony yourself. But that doesn't mean you reject Western technology outright. Ethiopia demonstrated this by adopting Western technology and using it to preserve its independence. And Japan would do the same thing. So all of these small states have something to teach us about how nations globally reacted to the increasing strength of Europe during the industrial age and its overseas expansion. So you should be able to answer those first two questions from the beginning of the presentation. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.